Welcome to Leading the Next Generation with Tim Elmore. I am your co-host, Andrew McPeak, and our mission here at Growing Leaders is to empower the emerging generations with skills to lead in real life. And Tim, today we're talking about challenges, a very specific set of challenges that are happening right now in the world of culture and social media, and that's these TikTok challenges, which I'm sure have been the bane of existence for many people out there.
Absolutely. In fact, Andrew, I was just thinking the TikTok challenges, really social media challenges in general, the last decade, they've been around quite a few years, is just a sort of new iteration of the peer pressure that's been going on for decades, if not centuries, among teenagers. It's just now that we have platforms like we have on TikTok, it's a new way of doing it.
Absolutely. And it's a new way of doing it virally, right?
Yeah.
Ideas like this spread amongst a community way back when. Today they're spreading it feels like the whole world, or at least the whole country, right? So I am sure that you had some things, some peer pressures or challenges that happened as you were growing up. Anything like that you want to share?
I do have one that was a bit embarrassing.
We're okay with embarrassing here.
Some of you remember reading your history books about the 1970s. That's when I was a teenager. Back in the 1970s, there were a number of kind of off-the-wall, out-of-the-box challenges going on. Peer pressure was
most
around.
of which probably got left in the 1970s.
This is true, and it's a good thing we left it. But streaking was a thing.
Yeah, I've heard about that fad.
Yeah, people start running across the ball field on a Thursday night baseball game without a stitch of clothing on. So I was in college. It was my freshman year, and I'm embarrassed about this, but all through the year, there was a group of guys on campus called the BRA.
Okay.
The BRA, the Bear Runners of America. I'm not kidding. And we would hear about them, but it was a sort of an anonymous sort of thing. But there was a kid named Tom. He was a senior. I was a freshman that came in and said, "You got to join us on this next one."
And what are you going to say? You're going to say no to Tom? He's a senior, right?
That's right. So, but I did say no at least once.
Okay.
I said no. He talked me into it.
Okay.
He talked me into it.
Peer pressure.
Oh my gosh. So yeah, I'm terribly embarrassed now, but this was 40 years ago, mind you.
Yeah.
But and thank God. But anyway, the Bear Runners of America, here's how they dressed. They completely had their clothes off, but they put their underwear on their head so they could stare through the two leg holes. Yeah. And then they wore a belt. The
70s were another time.
Oh,
Tim.
It was. Yeah. Yeah. And part of it people don't even remember. But
Yeah,
anyway,
I'm sure.
the Bear Runners of America would attack another floor in the dormitory, the residence hall.
Yep.
And they would open the door and flick on and off the lights. And the people in the dorm that were sleeping at 2 a.m. would wake up and see this scary figure out there with only a belt and underwear on their head, mind you. And then that was it.
I feel like we can wrap the podcast right here and just say, if you're feeling bad about kids and TikTok challenges, just be glad this isn't happening, right?
We've moved forward.
We have. Yes.
That's right. So anyway, that one didn't end well. I was found out and felt horrible.
Got in trouble and all that.
But that was a challenge. That was a challenge. And it's just, but I'm sure you had your own, didn't you?
It's funny is as I've heard about this trend of one of the challenges we're going to talk about today is the Blackout challenge. But there's been all kinds of challenges that have been on TikTok. But as soon as I heard about it, I just had this flashback memory of being a freshman in high school and watching some senior guys, who were really cool back when I was a freshman in high school, watching them actually do a version of what's happening on TikTok right now, which is, two guys kind of help another guy intentionally black out.
Yeah.
And so I literally was like, sitting in the cafeteria or whatever, watching this guy pass out on the floor. And then his friends are like slapping him back awake. And I just remember thinking, what in the world is happening? Yeah. And yet at the same time, because it's three senior guys, they look so cool doing that, But it's just the way often it feels like your brain works when you're an adolescent is you just kind of get confused about the difference between what's a bad decision and what's a really cool decision,
Right.
And that thing is happening today. Only we're adding to it the peer pressure power of social media.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So the role of social media has completely and dramatically changed peer pressure. And that's really the big idea in this. We need to figure out as caring adults, as teachers, parents, coaches, administrators, athletic directors, whoever's listening, how do we manage this social media portion of their lives, and to make sure that the challenges don't become absolutely deadly. That is not hyperbole.
Yeah. And that's, let's dig into some of those challenges, because deadly is actually the right word. So we've talked about TikTok challenges, but walk us through some of the ones that we're talking about today, the ones that are starting to have some negative effects.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, I want listeners to know, we know that many of the social media challenges are very charitable and positive.
Yep.
You remember the Ice Bucket Challenge way back in 2014.
Yeah.
People donating money, and it was a marvelous thing. So we can challenge in a redemptive, positive way on social media. But what we're hearing about this last year were kids literally dying on TikTok because a challenge was given. The Blackout Challenge was one of them, where kids were choking to death because they were challenged to do so. How long could you stay without breathing? And two young boys, teenagers, a 12-year-old boy in Oklahoma, T.J. Smith, and then Joshua Haliosis from Colorado, both died, and news reports were done. You can look this up on the news feeds. It was just so sad, and of course the parents were going, "How did this happen?"
Yeah.
It was a challenge, and the challengers are now not just look at the doofus thing that was done like I did, but they were deadly.
And of course, we want to say our condolences to that family, because you cannot imagine being in that situation. And these students are not just a prop for us to have a conversation about this. Honestly, some really good action has been taken. TikTok has removed all the hashtags associated with these challenges off, and it's actually incredibly hard to find videos of this happening anymore because of those actions that have been taken. But I think for us, it needs to raise the bigger question of how did we get here and what do we do about it, which is, I think, where we're headed.
So let's jump into that. First of all, I think it's important for us to acknowledge, just biologically and through neuroscience, kids are biologically built to become much more susceptible to peers in adolescence. The brain is forming and pruning itself during that period of time, and the frontal cortex is not developed as fast as the limbic system. So the reward centers of the brain, which say, do something crazy, you'll get a lot of rewards from your peers, is highly developed. And the consequences portion of the brain that calculates the negative.
Should I do this?
Yeah, that's right. It's not quite as developed. So you might see a kid doing a crazy thing on social media, or even on a skateboard for that matter, and they're just not calculating. And it's especially true with males, although all genders can be caught up in this. But I think it's important that we realize this is a natural part of adolescence. It always has been, and maybe always will be. The American Psychological Association has come out with articles. One article was called Popular, Finding Happiness and Success in a World That Cares Too Much About the Wrong Kinds of Relationships. Huge. The article said that social media challenges are especially attractive to adolescents who look to their peers for cues about what's socially acceptable. They crave the positive reinforcement from their friends and social networks, and they're more prone to risk-taking behaviors. That's the key. Even though this is a risk-averse generation in general, we're prone to risky behaviors with our peers. Okay?
Yeah.
So I think it's just important that we get this and we now respond, okay, how do we lead them through this?
Absolutely. This, the psychology stuff that you're talking about, it's important to remember this has always been true, right? This is the same reason why kids were doing dumb stuff in the 70s, like we talked about, versus dumb stuff now. So again, brain science is not changing over time. What is changing is the power of the forces that are acting upon the kids that we're leading today, right?
That's right.
It's the difference between having 2 or 3 friends at your school who say, you should do this, versus having thousands of people who are coming at you on your social media feed all the time saying, you should do this. It's a totally different ballgame in terms of the intensity of the force.
And that's the influence of social media. A 2016 study in the Journal of Psychological Science found that teens were more likely to like, quote unquote, I'm going to put a like on this, popular photos than those with fewer likes. A finding that held true for both neutral photos and those depicting risky behaviors such as drinking or smoking or things like that. So viewing photos with many likes is connected to the activity in the parts of the brain associated with imitation. You see somebody else doing it, you go, I can do that too.
Yeah.
So in short, If a bunch of kids see something and like it, it's almost impossible for them to resist at 15, 14 years old, psychologically speaking. Brown University psychologist Jacqueline Nessie says, and I quote, social media creates powerful incentives to maximize positive peer feedback and approval. End quote. And these TikTok challenges just prove that point.
It's true. It's true. Well, one of the things I think is interesting before we move on, because you're going to get really practical with us here on how do we actually lead kids well through this, is we actually want to break down when we're talking about peer pressure, whether honestly it's peer pressure on social media or peer pressure, with one friend to another, right, in person. There are different kinds of peer pressure, and sort of breaking those things down can help us maybe process what we're talking about when we're talking about peer pressure, because a student may say, I'm experiencing peer pressure, but it's not quite at the level as maybe this other student is experiencing peer pressure. Right. So understanding the different categories is helpful here.
This is so intriguing to me. Listeners, we're going to talk about 4 kinds of peer pressure now. And this comes really from the research from Dr. Mitchell Prinstein from the American Psychological Association. He breaks it down this way, and I think he gives language for us to understand why in the world would that 15-year-old do that?
Yeah.
So number 1 of the 4 is overt peer pressure. So this is somebody that's saying, well, you better do this or else I won't be your friend.
Yeah.
I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but
well, that might actually get said.
Yeah, absolutely. So we think, well, good God, I don't want to lose a friend. I don't want to lose my community that I'm coming to identify with. So I'll go ahead and do this less than smart behavior. And I think that's very, very real. This is literally a global audience of people on social media that can provide this type of cajoling 24/7.
And what's so interesting is when we talk about peer pressure, this is almost always the peer pressure we think about, right? So our kid does something dumb and we go, who told you to do that, right? We assume that all peer pressure is this overt style. But what's interesting is there's 3 other kinds of peer pressure that you're about to talk about.
That's right. But you remember your mom or my mom maybe back in the day. So if Johnny Finnegan jumped off the Empire State Building, you would jump off the, Yeah, I actually would.
I might, Mom. That's right. Yeah, if I had a good parachute, probably.
That's right. All right. So peer pressure number 2 is what Prinstein calls deviancy training. So it's not literally training, but we're conditioned to be deviant. So this is when adolescents get positive reinforcement for doing things that are considered cool, but in actuality often include breaking the rules or engaging in dangerous behavior.
Yeah.
So nobody's saying I won't be your friend, but going, man, if you don't do this, you're not even cool, man. That sort of thing. So this can be getting likes on a screen, as simple as that. And it's simple to punch that button with a thumbs up. And all of a sudden you realize, well, I got to do this. I just have to.
I got rewarded for it. Why wouldn't I do it again? What's interesting is one name that you will often see on TikTok for the names for these challenges are deviant licks is actually a term that will get used. So it is interesting that kids themselves are using the very same lingo that this psychologist is saying, that's exactly what's going on.
So true. And marketers actually appeal to that.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. So peer pressure number 3 is what Prinstein calls the misestimation of norms. The misestimation of norms. Teenage brains are constantly trying to get a sense of what's normal and whether they fit into the majority, okay? Whether you want to be alternative or not, you want to say, here's the deal. In fact, I love the one frame comic that I saw years ago. I've never forgotten it. It's a college student with long hair, tattoos, flip-flops on, talking to his dad, and he basically says, but Dad, I got to be a nonconformist if I'm going to be like everybody else. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. I want to be different, but I want to be the same.
Yes.
That's been true about teenagers in every generation for centuries. So we're trying to estimate what's the norm, and social media complicates this. I'm going to say that again, listeners. Social media complicates this because if there are 20 posts on your newsfeed about the coronavirus challenge, you might think everybody's doing it, but it might just be those 20 people, not the 2 billion other people on TikTok. So you think, it's norm, but it's not at all.
They've reoriented what normal is.
That's right.
And all of a sudden, your definition of normal is not just established by what's going on in your community. It's also established by what's going on in your global community, right?
Yeah.
And it's almost unfair how normal gets defined in those contexts.
Absolutely. No doubt about it. So the 4th and final type of peer pressure that Mitchell Prinstein talks about is identity enhancement. Identity enhancement. This, to me, was the most significant of all, just in my opinion. As adults, we're more apt to have a secure sense of self. You've been around long enough, you go, here's who I am, here's who I'm not, it is what it is, that sort of thing. But in adolescence and your teenage years, we judge our identities based on good and bad peer feedback because we're trying to figure out who we are.
Yeah.
Let's face it, in middle school, you don't know yet. So if a friend on social media participates in a viral challenge and gets hundreds of likes, we see that positive reinforcement and we think, I'm not as good as that. I want to be that.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and do it to shift our identity that way. In fact, you led some focus groups. Talk about what we learned.
Yeah, I mean, I did focus groups for years in preparation for some work we were doing. It actually came out in that book, Generation Z Unfiltered, that we worked on together. And back in those focus groups, we would see this norm over and over again. When a student was asked questions about their identity, how people could recognize them, especially middle school students that we interviewed said they drew their primary sense of identity from their social media presence.
Crazy.
Yeah. And it wasn't just their public Instagram page.
Yeah.
It was also all of the Finstas and other things that they were using. But that sense of identity of who I am was directly attached to the different identities that they were exploring online and how those things were being rewarded with likes and comments from their peers.
So their identity didn't come from their family name,
No.
where they sat in the lunchroom, the sports team they played on,
Yeah.
their faith, whatever. Commonly what you tend to identify with as you grow older.
Yeah.
It was who I am on social media, which at best is an emotional roller coaster of likes and unlikes or whatever. So we need to get to the answer. We just have a few more minutes, but lead us into this, Andrew, because we've got to at least have a handful of ideas to offer.
Yeah, and that's where we want to, we love to get practical on this podcast. So as we sat down and thought about what do we do, I know you came up with a few ideas of conversations that we can have with our students. Obviously, we cannot sit there and police them through every single interaction on TikTok or any other social media platform, which means if we're going to approach a solution, it has to be a solution where we lead them to some better ways of interacting, right?
Yeah.
So walk us through a few practical ideas for how we might do this well.
Well, let me reiterate before I jump into this. This is easy to understand what we're about to say, but very difficult to implement because these are human beings that are in their teenage years that we're trying to not control, but navigate and manage.
Yeah.
So the key is to keep the lines of communication open. I love what my friend Andy Stanley says, don't freak out. That's the number one rule.
Yeah.
Don't freak out when they do something crazy and you just don't understand it as a 45-year-old maybe, why they would do such a thing. Help them see why certain trends can be destructive, and that's where the communication comes in. So idea number one, I think, is literally to talk to them about rewards and consequences.
Yeah, that idea.
Talk to them about rewards and consequences. Remember, the part of the brain that calculates rewards is stronger than the one that calculates consequences. So they won't see or think ahead clearly on, oh, I didn't think that I might get XYZ, an F on the paper, or if I cheated, or I might get hurt jumping off the cliff or whatever it is. So talk to your students about how their brains develop and are still developing up until they're 25, 26 years old. And while it may sound cool to do something like this, rewards, we often don't take time to consider the consequences, help them think that through. Don't make the decision for them unless they're 12, but say, I would think twice about this. It's your call. And I remember doing this with my own children, and it was very helpful because just me saying, you can make this call, but I would think twice. A person, they were almost always thinking, well, Dad, I don't think you're cool, but if you're saying think twice, maybe I ought to think twice about this.
Yeah. You know what this is reminding me of is actually one of our habitudes, sturdy guardrails, right? If you think about the rewards and the consequences of driving down a windy mountain pass, the reward is I'm driving really fast down the road.
That's right.
The consequence is I might go off and careen down the mountain and horrible things can happen. The guardrail is that thing I've put in place, whether it's a person or a standard that can just remind me not to drive too fast, to kind of keep me in the lane, all those kinds of things. And that's exactly what we're encouraging our students to do, is to recognize there are rewards, there are consequences, and we need things in our lives that helps us make sure that we don't careen off the side of the mountain, more or less.
I like the fact that you said it could be people in our lives, it could be parents, friends, whatever, or values or standards. But the point is, every one of us, even us as adults, need guardrails so that we don't veer off the path.
Love it.
Okay.
Number two.
The second idea, again, simple to understand, difficult to implement, is share with your students about the positive and negative reinforcement. This is a psychological principle, the positive and negative reinforcement. So in behavioral psychology, there are two kinds of reinforcement, positive and negative. Positive reinforcement is when a behavior is more likely to happen again because the user had a positive experience.
Yeah.
So think some kid gets on TikTok, they start laughing their heads off. It was a really good experience.
Yeah.
They're more apt to get on a second time because they laughed a lot the first time.
Yeah.
Why not do it again?
Why not do that again? Yeah.
That's right. They get on a social media platform, even TikTok, and it's less than stellar. It was boring or not so much. They're less apt.
Yep.
I think we need to help them understand you're going to be more apt to do things that are pleasurable. I know this sounds so simple, but we don't think all the time. Hey, we are too.
Yeah.
Stuff that gives us pleasure, those wonderful chemicals in our brain are released, the endorphins, we keep doing it. And I think it's just important that we explain, at least in terms they would understand, how positive and negative reinforcement work.
Absolutely. Well, the other thing I would point out, if you look at the early days of social media and you look at the current days of social media, I think one of the big differences between TikTok today and maybe MySpace way back in the day is I think TikTok understands, and it's baked right into the structure of the program itself. It understands this positive and negative reinforcement thing. And it's actually, it's acknowledging and shaping the people who participate in it and trying to leverage this psychology aspect in order to get them to spend more time on the platform.
That's right. Absolutely. So the third and final idea we have for you is we suggest you talk to them about others their age who are quitting social media altogether, or at least fasting from technology for a season. Now, this may floor you, but 34% of Generation Z members say they're permanently quitting social media. That's more than 1 out of 3.
That's crazy.
Not 1 out of 100 like you might expect. 1 out of 3. So kids are tuning in, or at least becoming aware, this isn't good for me. I don't like how I feel. Depression, anxiety, stressed out when I get on these platforms. So 34% of members of Gen Z are quitting it altogether, and 64% are at least taking a break. That's 2 out of 3 just about. According to new research from the Origin Hill Holidays in-house research arm. So the survey of more than 1,000 18 to 24-year-olds across America discovered a total of 41% feel anxious, sad, or depressed because of social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, or Snapchat. It's interesting to me, Andrew, that so many are aware of the problem and they're actually taking an initiative themselves as teenagers to just get off.
Talk about positive peer pressure. I can guarantee you that your kids are not going to get on TikTok and find kids talking about how they're leaving TikTok, right? So there's a whole slew of young people out there who are making positive decisions, but often our kids who are on social media are not exposed to those young people. So even just talking to them about this new trend of kids going, you know what, I need to take a break for my mental health and I need to step away, introducing them to that can introduce some sort of contrary peer pressure that says you don't just have to do everything that you see everybody else doing on TikTok, because there's a whole other group of people who said, you know what, I don't buy into that.
So Andrew, I want you to close this out. You began to ask some of the administrators, school administrators, that were, what are you guys doing about this TikTok challenge? How are you handling social media? And you got a number of good responses, but one, a dear friend of ours, a principal at Lambert High School, just had a great reversal of this challenge. Talk about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, like so many of you who are probably navigating these TikTok challenges, we wanted to reach out and just see what different principals and leaders whom we really respect how they were sort of handling it. So I reached out to Gary Davison as among other principals and just asked, what does this look like for you guys? And he said some really fascinating things. He said teachers, counselors, admin during this really hard time have all been working together to set the standard for expected behavior for students and setting a culture for kids to be successful. However, the support for these expectations and positive behavior seems to be waning as there's more and more frustration. And he pointed out that's frustration from students, it's frustration from parents, it's overworked teachers, it's all of those things. And then when they added those TikTok challenges on top of it, it was just, it was just a recipe for disaster. So one of the things that he decided to do that was really interesting is at their school, they introduced brand new TikTok challenges. So rather than getting on the PA system, as many school leaders did, by the way, and going, quit damaging the bathrooms and quit, spray painting the walls or whatever. They got on and said, hey guys, we heard about TikTok challenges. Some of them are negative. What if we came up with some positive ones? So they put out a challenge to their students and said, we challenge you guys to come up with a TikTok challenge that's positive, that does some good in our school or in our community, and then put it on TikTok, call it the whatever it is challenge. And he actually had several students that did this, and their stuff went viral on TikTok, which is cool. And so he was able to kind of say, what if we stopped seeing these peer pressure moments as the enemy that we need to just, tackle and aggressively go after, and instead go, why don't we take the creativity and positive peer pressure that could be out there and sort of flip it on its head and say, what could we make out of this?
They were redirecting the challenge.
Absolutely.
I love it.
Yeah,
Good.
I love that too. Well, Tim, thank you so much for leading us through today. We've been talking about some really important topics, how to help students manage their emotions, think about their decisions, assess their situations, critical thinking, all of those things. If you're looking for a way to have these conversations in a more robust way and on a kind of scheduled process, we actually have a curriculum that covers this. We call it Habitudes for Social and Emotional Learning. If you're unfamiliar with habitudes, habitudes are simply images that form leadership habits and attitudes. And what we've done is we've collected a whole bunch of habitudes that form habitudes for social and emotional learning. So we're tackling social and emotional skills, utilizing imagery, metaphor, and story. If you want to find out more about habitudes for social and emotional learning, either the middle school edition or the high school edition, head on over to growingleaders.com/SEL. It's a great way to start really fun conversations with your students about some of these life skills that are honestly going to make a huge difference when they're trying to make positive decisions on social media. So check that out. Again, it's growingleaders.com/SEL. Well, as always, if you would rate this podcast, give us 5 stars on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. That gets the word out about what we're doing here. You can also quite literally get the word out by sharing this podcast with a friend who you think might find it helpful. Please do that. If you want to connect with us online, we are at Growing Leaders and at Tim Elmore, pretty much everywhere you are. And then finally, if you have ideas for this podcast, maybe it's somebody you think we should interview or a topic we should cover, shoot us an email. It's podcast@growingleaders.com. We love getting those. Tim, thank you again so much for challenging us to think about how we're leading our kids well. Thank you guys for listening and for leading so well, and we'll see you next time.